Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second Kids Sport Diversity and Inclusion in Sport speaker series. My name is Andrea Carey. I'm the Chief Inclusion Officer for Inclusion Incorporated, and very pleased to be your moderator today to walk us through this incredible conversation around gender identities in sport. So we're going to begin with just a little bit of an introduction to get us started. And just to set some context about the speaker series itself. So we brought this together because Kids Sport really believes that in education and the responsibility to ensure that the kids that we're supporting through our funding are able to have the best possible experience in sport and physical activity. And we know they come from a wide range of backgrounds. And so working together to create better inclusion in the sport clubs, communities, and programs that they're a part of. This whole series is powered by the Calgary Flames Foundation, and we're incredibly grateful for their support and grateful to get to work with them to bring this to life. So as I said, this is the second in the series, and we will be continuing these through December. So check out the next ones coming up. We'll do a little promo at the end to talk about that. I want to begin today by acknowledging the territories that I'm coming to you from today. Those are of the Coast Salish peoples out here in Victoria, and the nations that I am grateful to be an uninvited settler on their lands are those of the Wasanich, the Esquimalt, and the Songhees nations. And I feel that it is my responsibility to continue to learn their origin stories, to understand the histories of the lands, the impacts of colonization, and the opportunity to build relationships and work towards reconciliation together. So to frame today's conversation, the population of Canada that identifies as being trans is about 175,000 people. And as we'll hear today, the journey of individuals' gender identities are very diverse and really beautiful stories. And we have so much to learn about how we can better support individuals of different gender identities across our sports system. So with that, I'm going to introduce our two speakers and to invite them into the room as I do so. So I'm going to begin with Ryan Gushulak. Ryan identifies as they, them. And Ryan is a trans, masculine, non-binary sports administrator in the National Sport Organization System. Ryan's job is working in safe sport and athlete services and creating safe spaces for athletes to share their stories with them. Ryan works really to bring the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion to life and to create safer environments, a skill that they share in their work with CAS, the Canadian Artistic Swimming, and also with Inclusion Incorporated as a collaborator. So welcome, Ryan. We're going to hear a little bit more from Ryan in a few moments. Our second guest and panelist is Ness Murby. Ness identifies as he, him. Ness is the first openly trans Paralympian in the world. Very exciting. And Ness is active and competitive in his category in his first season competing as his authentic self in the men's category. And you'll hear a little bit more about Ness's sporting journey as we go through today. Ness has represented 3 countries and in 3 different parasports. So Australia, Japan, and Canada in the sports of goalball, powerlifting, and para-athletics. Ness has a background in mental health, physical health, project management, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, design, educational processes, and strategy, which he now brings to his role at Inclusion Incorporated as a manager of inclusive projects and design. So welcome to both of you. So excited to have this conversation. So grateful to have you joining us. So Ryan, I'm going to go to you first to tell us a little bit more about your journey of how you got to where you're at, and also your journey of identity and gender.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andrea, for the quick introduction. As Andrea said, my name's Ryan Gushulak, and I identify as being trans masculine and non-binary. And as she said, I work in the safe sport movement for my day job with artistic swimming. So a little bit more about me is I grew up in a very small town in rural Manitoba of about 800 people. Our town is known to be the cattle capital of Manitoba, so there are significantly more cows than there are people that I grew up around. But my hometown was very small, and for me, being trans and coming to the realization and finding the language did not happen right away. It happened once I was in university, and shortly after university, I started coming out as being trans. So it's truly a journey for me. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always easy in sport, but through living my authentic life and being my authentic self now, I find within the sports season, all I found in the sports system is acceptance and belonging. So, I mean, I'll be sharing more as we continue on here today, but thanks, Andrea.
Thanks so much for that, Ryan. And Ness, I'm going to turn it over to you with the same question to share a bit more about your journey and your journey of gender identity.
Thanks, Andrea, and good day, everyone. I'm Ness Murby, pronouns he, him, and I'm originally an Aussie and a proud Canadian. My journey through gender identity really kind of started in terms of awareness for me at the age of 6, where I was asked that question, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's a very normative question. And there I was, proud as punch, and said, I want to be a husband and a dad. And I was lucky because the person who asked me that question was my gran, and her and I are very close. And her response to that was, yeah, you should have been born a boy. And I thought, wow, I'm seen. Going on from that, what I recognized was my gran's pretty special, and the world did not respond to me the way that my gran had. So I didn't know anyone like me. I didn't know anyone growing up who had those thoughts or aspirations. And so I started editing myself so that I could create a version of myself that was going to be more palatable to society. And that version of myself labeled me as gay. And that was a label that was acceptable, that was, coming out and around at the time. And it was something that was not just taught to me, but put upon me. And so for many years, I didn't talk about how I felt on the inside, which also made it very difficult for me. But I formulated the idea that others must just feel the way I do. And so that's what gay is. And that was really interesting to me because it wasn't until my 20s that I first heard the word trans in context. And finally, there was this breath, this exhale. It took until my 30s for me to really embrace that that's who I am and always have been. And then it took years beyond that to actually come out openly, because coming out openly was actually risking it all for me. And that's something that I think is telling for our world today, that to show up as your authentic self shouldn't be paired with risking it all. And that's something I hope to change in my visibility and being openly out. So thank you for having me here today, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion.
What a beautiful wish and vision for our system, NASA, and looking forward to working with you to bring that to reality. I think conversations like the conversation we're having today are such an important part of that, so that folks can learn and understand what some of those journeys are and what they need to be thinking about and planning for to create more supportive and safer systems for folks identifying as trans or gender identities that maybe we haven't thought of or explored in the sports system in the ways we need to. So we're going to share a little bit on terminology. Ryan's going to lead us through a slide talking about some terms so that folks have an opportunity to digest those and kind of think through them. When we go at the end of the session, we're going to have an opportunity for discussion tables, and one of the discussion tables will be around the terminology. So here we go. We can dig in a little bit. Over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Andrea. Ness, feel free to unmute and jump in if you feel like you want to. But we talk about terminology, I think, here in this space quite a lot, because the terminology changes quite quickly and quite often. And I think in this space, what I always like to iterate and make really clear is that don't get hung up specifically on the exact definitions of all of these terms because they change so frequently. People are going to identify and describe their identity in whichever way best suits them. So these are some high level different gender identities that fall underneath as what we call here is the trans umbrella. The thing that's important also here to note, and I'll share a little anecdote about myself here as well, is not everyone who might have one of these identities being non-binary or agender or genderqueer will also say that they are trans or identify with being transgender. So basically what transgender means is just anything that's not cisgender. So not people who don't identify with their sex that they were assigned at birth. So when I was born, the doctor looked at me and said, yeah, you're a girl. So I had an F put on my birth certificate. I don't identify as that. So technically I'm trans. So for me, for a lot of years when I was coming out, I would say, you know, I'm non-binary, I'm not trans. And it took me a long time to be okay with the word trans and transgender. And it came from, you know, some internalized transphobia. And, you know, I worked my way through it. And now I can say that I'm trans and I'm completely fine with it. But it's important to note that not everyone will be comfortable using trans or identify being trans. So quickly, I'm going to go over just the words that we see on the screen here. And the only identities I'm talking about are things that aren't the gender binary terms of male and female. So the things that other people are identifying as. So we've talked about what trans is quickly. Bigender is someone who identifies with having two genders. Agender is when a person does not identify with having a distinct gender. Non-binary is used to describe people who feel that their gender cannot be defined within the confines of the gender binary. So that's where I see myself. Gender fluid is a person who does not identify with having a fixed gender, so may fluctuate between genders or within gender spaces and express things differently, and it's very fluid. Two-spirit, which I don't see on here, but should be on here. Two-spirit is an umbrella term used to describe the multifaceted non-Western genders and sexualities in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. These identities are vast and unique depending on the individual community that someone may be coming from. And then genderqueer and gender nonconforming relate to a person whose behavior or appearance does not conform to our normalized cultural and social expectations about what is appropriate to one's gender. So again, there's a lot of terms here and that's a lot of definitions. You can find them in your workbook. I think Kevin sent everyone who registered an email. So they're also all at the back of your workbook. All of these are written down to review later. But that will start a little bit of a base for us on moving forward with this conversation.
Thanks so much for that, Ryan. And as we go through, if you've got questions about that or you want us to dig in a little bit more, feel free to post them in the Q&A. I just made a note in the chat that we'll be monitoring that as we go through, but we have lots of questions to dig into with both Ryan and Ness, so looking forward to doing that. So I want to also reflect that we had Trans Day of Visibility about 2 weeks ago, and such an important opportunity for us to kind of pause and reflect on how we're seeing and supporting trans folks across society. And so then we think about sort of sport and how trans identities are showing up in sport and what we need to do to support both of you are like anyone who's identifying as, I'm going to say, one of the not binary genders, which we've typically built things around. So let's maybe start with what sport has meant to each of you. You both covered it a little bit in your introduction, but what does that mean to you and how's that changed over time? So Ness, maybe we'll begin with you.
Certainly. Thanks so much. I think I bring an interesting intersectionality to this question of being a para-athlete. And so I like to look at this as, one of the positive costs of being a para-athlete, which is, ironically, my disability provided gender labeling solace. Because when you fall under that umbrella, in my experience of being disabled, there's not a lot of consideration for your gender, for your sexuality even. These conversations aren't had, and I think that that's part to do with a perception of disability. So for me, I also got another when I moved into parasport, this exhale, because thank goodness I'm disabled first. Oh, okay. That comes with its own challenges, of course. But also, blind sports are less stereotypically gendered, and that's, due to them sort of already being segregated. So again, this idea of segregated within a segregated group, and this raises that topic of how you choose to frame things. So yes, there has been a lot of harm and a lot of oppression in my life, and also how I navigate that and come out of that trauma is also how I'm going to reframe those narratives. Goalball, which is a blind specific sport, is a team sport. And at the world level, it meant an all-female environment for me. So there I was doing really well in goalball. Please come join our national team. And unfortunately, that started to aggravate my dissonance with myself and who I was. And it became kind of a painful reminder that I was not perceived as one of the guys, where when I was beneath that world level, I was training with the guys. And that's got to do with the number of athletes that are in the sport at the time. So I moved on to powerlifting, and powerlifting is not stereotypically synonymous, or at least it wasn't. And this allowed me to sort of further develop my masculine appearance and at the same time be perceived as a valued member of society as I broke world records and took titles. However, powerlifting isn't in the Paralympics. So here we go again with this intersectionality and this crossover. So I move into para-athletics. And I'll say that also talent transferring in the para world is very common because of this reason. So I move into para-athletics, and it's included in the Paralympic Games. And so I converted to throws, and it was kind of a natural progression. And then the higher up the value ladder I went, the heavier the pushback was of my sense of self, because there I was standing on the podium being recognized for my skill with a really oppressive label. And it took until 2020 for me to say I can't carry that burden anymore. And so I think that that's something that's really interesting of what sport has meant to me. And it's meant a huge journey of self-discovery and perseverance and adversity. However, not necessarily in the channels that one would think. And so I've come out of that as a really strong individual and a strong sense of self, and something that I advocate for and try to be, as Andrea mentioned, transgender visibility, visible for others, so that no one else is sort of looking there and going, I can't see myself in sport. So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Wow, a beautiful reflection on sort of how you've moved through that. And what strikes me is so many labels that you're trying to navigate as you went through that journey. Yeah. Ryan, I'm going to go to you.
I always feel bad going after Ness because Ness is such a tough act to follow. But sport for me, I think it was a little bit different than for Ness. I grew up in my small town. There were two sport options. There was a winter and a summer sport. So it was either hockey or baseball. And those were the only options. Like, we didn't get a soccer team in my hometown or a soccer program probably until I was, I don't know, a teenager maybe. So I played hockey and I played baseball in the summer. And for me, who I am is all because of sport. My hometown's a little bit rough, and the people in it are great people, but it's very blue collar, and it's very much a very small town, and it has a lot of substance use issues. So sport for me was my way out. It was my avenue to education, to get out. So I latched onto hockey, and I was a half decent hockey player. So for me, my sport was always the saving grace in my life and with my friends and all those types of things. That's where I built good relationships. That's where I found a place where it wasn't so hard all the time. And similar to Ness's story, before I came out as trans, I came out as being gay and having and living that life. And for me, sport and being in hockey and playing mostly female hockey once I became a teenager, because keep in mind, in an 800-person town, I played boys hockey until there was enough girls in the region of Manitoba where we all drove 2 hours one way for practice, and by enough people to make a team that was 8 people. I played boys hockey, so within those environments, I found, you know, I was one of the guys when I played on the boys teams, and because all of the girls that I played with when we got a little bit older also played on all guys teams, we were also just kind of like one of the boys, also still just playing in the female league. So I found a lot of solace and opportunity with that. My time with sport has changed. I went from being an athlete and things like that now to working in sport administration. So the feelings and the solace that I had in sport, that is what I try to replicate for athletes in the sports system. Now I try to create spaces and work with programs to create spaces that athletes like coming into, that they can find themselves in and enjoy their time there. And it can be about more than, you know, what's going on in their personal lives and things like that. It hasn't always been easy, and with being trans in sport, there are definitely hiccups and challenges that I've overcome and continue to have to overcome as a sport administrator. But I think sport, for a lot of reasons, is moving in the right direction, even though there are lots of hiccups within the identity space within sport.
So Ryan, let's stay with you on that topic around, like, what do we want sport to do to create spaces for you to show up, or for someone who identifies as trans that is like, is this for me? Like, you've both spoken a little bit about that theme, but what do those spaces and places look like? What do we need to do to build that support?
I think sport in Canada, or when I think of sport in Canada, like, yeah, I work at a high level and I work mostly with Olympians and aspiring Olympians for the sport that I'm in. But I would say 99% of sport is grassroots and recreational at its core level. So for most of us, or for most people working in sports system, we're just striving to create an environment that's fun and safe and positive for kids and people to be in. So are there different strategies to degender sports? I know for the sport that I'm in, it's traditionally cisgender and female. However, in the rule book, if we do have male or male identified competitive athletes, like within our structure, we don't separate a male category and a female category if they're in a solo event, for example. There's just a ranking of 1 to however many people that were in the solo. So I think in grassroots level, finding ways to differently categorize sports, whether maybe it's not by gender, maybe it's about, you know, do kids want to play contact sport, or do they want to play a version that's non-contact? Like, do they want to play tackle football, or is there a flag football league? And it can be mixed gender, or whatever version of the names that we want to go with. Like, I think that's one way, is to give options not based on gender, but on skill or sport type or rule structure or things like of that nature, for the most part. And then as we get higher, there's other restrictions that get placed on athletes and organizations from international federations and different things like that, which are harder to get around, but it's something that people at national levels and international bodies need to be looking at, also being creative. It's just, in the Canadian context, like staying domestically, I think there's lots we can do at the grassroots level to open things up and open doors for people to feel more included and feel more safe entering these environments.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so powerful. And Laura McPhee, who's on our team at Inclusion Inc., talks about, like, at what age does it actually matter? Like, does gender come into play? And typically pre-puberty, it doesn't come into play at all. So how do we start to think about that in setting up some of the sporting opportunities, competition opportunities, to create spaces for people to show up in whatever type of playing environment they want to? So Ness, we're going to go to you with that same question in terms of what do you need sport to do to create space for you, for other trans athletes?
I really like that, Ryan, you brought up the individuality and the uniqueness of sports, by way of saying how in your individual events that they're actually just numbered, and I think that sort of follows on to my mindset of looking at this as a puzzle of inclusion rather than negating who belongs in the room. And so to my mind, how that comes about of starting to, put that puzzle together is to start looking at leadership, because at, the athlete level, at the individual person level, we have a lot of voices. unfortunately, with sport, it tends to be an authoritative hierarchy. And so the message needs to come from the top. And to my mind, that means that we need to have leadership that's investing in curiosity, because when you invest in curiosity, you're starting to foster communications and respect, and you're asking questions, and you're showing a willingness to learn rather than assume or also follow old orthodox norms that potentially have no place in this space anymore. And I think then it's like leadership challenge the status quo that we find in those orthodox norms. And finally, it's leadership that is safe to approach, builds trust. When I came out, I didn't feel that I was in a place that was safe to approach my leadership, to let them know that I was coming out as trans. Then as I moved through my trend, that was in 2020, as I moved through my self-discovery and recognized that I wanted to begin HRT, which is hormone replacement, I recognized it wasn't about there being a safe space. I just needed to state that this is who I am and be ready to fight and challenge what I faced. So when I started HRT, which was August of 2021, this notion of I didn't feel that I necessarily had leadership that was safe to approach, but I did it anyway. And that's about me saying that where this conversation I would like to go is it shouldn't be a but I did it anyway. We all need to be growing, and we can't do things that better that we don't know that we need to do better. But once we know, that old adage from Maya Angelou, once we know better, do better. And so we need to be creating a space where we are approachable, where leaders are approachable, where we're creating space for individuals. And it can't be assumed that athletes or members of our organizations know that we're approachable.
Yeah, such an important piece of the equation. And I love that you kind of owned, like, okay, this is what I need to do, and I'm going to have to kind of face that hard conversation. But I know some of those conversations are not safe conversations. And what does it look like when, you either get support or it goes the other way and you get excluded because of telling your truth? So, Ness, let's stay with you.
100%. And I think something that I would add to, sorry, go ahead.
No, keep going. You're good.
Oh, I was going to say that something that I would add to that when you were mentioning, like, yes, the braving the unsafe conversations, is I recognize my privilege in the extensive oppression I've undergone, and my privilege is I'm older, and I was in a place where I felt willing to risk that for not just my gains, but for the next generation. I felt that I was at an age where I was ready to do something for and able to do something for the next generation at the cost to myself. And that's something I want to highlight of, please, we need to stop asking individuals to do that, especially when we're talking about at what age does sport become a gender conversation. Let's not ask 6-year-olds to be advocating in this space. Let's not ask 13-year-olds. Let's actually stand up and do the work as the organization for these kids, these athletes, these teenagers, these young humans who are trying to just play sport.
Yeah. What does that look like, Ness, when it's done well? Like when sport is really taking care of trans athletes? And what about when it's done poorly?
Yeah, really good question. For me, when it's done well, it's not having to explain my identity at every meet, and whether a meet being a competition or at every meeting. That's sort of not the, let me start with a disclaimer, I'm trans, can we have this conversation? We need to be having those conversations without the disclaimer, without giving people the forewarning to put on their trans supportive hat. Being able to register more specifically for a competition without gender trauma. This idea of just creating the space to tick a registration box that is which class you want to be in, as opposed to what gender you are assigned at birth. And we need to expand the categories, because also the dichotomy of gender categories is no longer applicable. So a club taking the lead on where my event or participation is scheduled. So I recognize that for me as a para athlete, I am segregated, and so often I am situated as just an individual competing on their own somewhere in the schedule. So it does actually afford the privilege of greater awareness and I guess more inclusion. Again, that shouldn't be the case. So we need to be actually taking into account when people are competing within our organizations, and that we're not, for example, placing someone who identifies as non-binary or identifies as male to be competing with female identifying individuals. And that's going to be tricky. I'm not saying that we have solutions right now. I'm saying we need to open up this conversation and start brainstorming with intentionality and consciousness.
Yeah, you've given some really tangible examples there. And I think, for the folks listening today to think about, like, what does your registration form look like? Are you using gender binaries? How are you kind of, I'm going to say, kind of closing people into their options and maybe limiting who they are in just that one process? And so how do you start to blow that open and create space for people to show up as they are? So and then, the layers of, like, how do you then think about the change rooms and what's needed there, and lots of layers. So I love how we're sort of peeling the onion open, as it were, to examine some of that. So Ryan, I'm going to go to you with that question around what does it look like when it's done well in sport and when it's not?
I feel like for me, the easiest way to talk about it is it's what was done well in my case when I came out to the organization I'm at now. As Ryan, when I started with my current organization, it wasn't the name that I used. I used my birth name, and it was fine. And then, a year in, or however long it was, I changed my name legally. So I, a whole bunch of other stuff that comes with that. So emails got to change. People need to know all this kind of thing. So I have a unique role with my organization, that I work very closely with athletes directly. I'm constantly with them. So I chose to tell my CEO only, and then tell the athletes first for the organization. We are in sports, and we all have jobs in sport because of athletes. And if athletes weren't existing, then none of us have a job to do. So I chose to tell the athletes first, because they need to know who they're dealing with as their safe sport person, who they can come and ask questions to, and how to be approachable. So it was great. The athletes asked me one simple question was, do we call you Ryan now, or do you want it later? That was it. It's the only question I got. And simple answer, like, yeah, call me Ryan now. Like, I'm not telling you just for kicks. And then my organization let me tell everyone else on my own time. Like, I told the staff at different times in different ways. I told the board on different times in different ways. But before I did this change, I found an ally on the board, on my board of directors, to tell first and have good conversations with. So, like, if I did get pushed back, then I had someone at the board level who knew the story and knew what I was doing and why, and the background and things like that. So I'm, like, forever grateful for that particular board member. And that was great. And for the groups of people that I wasn't willing to accept questions from, my CEO handled that for me. And told them up front, like, don't ask Ryan. They're not going to answer your questions about their individual identity. Where my staff, my close staff members and my team, they can ask me more what they want, because I have to work with them day to day, and it's part of my job. But for more external people, it was not. I mean, in terms of, so that was what was good, was that, like, I came out on my own time. I wasn't pressured by my organization, and I got to lead the process, and I had say in it. I wasn't mandated to do anything that I wasn't comfortable with. So that would be my takeaway for what sport can do well. If you do have a kid, an athlete, a coach, whoever who is transitioning or changing or doing whatever in this space, let them lead. Make it consent-based. If they don't want to tell people, that's fine. If they only go by a chosen name or a different pronoun with their teammates and they do with their families, respect that, keep that boundary for them. It's okay. They need to lead the process, though. In my particular case, I was lucky that that I've only had decent experiences in this space in sport. I haven't had anything that was from the sport administrator perspective in my own story, but I think there's lots of things that are potentially poorly done within this space. I think a lot of it in sport comes down to the change rooms and who should be where and who's allowed where and things like that. So I've heard stories from other people in sport of trans people being in their locker rooms and families not liking it and organizations not knowing what to do as their own risk and liability from an organizational perspective. If they're using like a city facility, like, oh, what are we supposed to do if and when? Well, talk to the city. Like, if the parents are concerned, like, they talk to the city. It's not about you. But if we all come from the space of like treating people first as people, like wherever we are coming across them, like we're going to avoid a lot of things and a lot of issues in sport. So I think if you take it by a person by person approach, and this is all individual, so it's not a one size fits all blanket that's going to work for everyone for what's going to be good and what's going to go bad. So talk to people. If you have someone in your organization who's in this space, ask them questions. If they're comfortable with it, they'll probably tell you the answer that they want, or what they want done. I would say most people who I've met that are trans are open to questions if they're done in a respectful way, because it's just easier than for have someone assume what you would like.
Yeah, some really great points there. I want to stay on that theme a little bit, Ryan, because you've so generously shared sort of some of your experience. And I want to touch on pronouns, but also, in that transition of coming out and sharing that in your organization, were there examples of being misgendered or dead named that were harmful for you? And you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Classic. Were there examples being misgendered? I would say I have a pretty thick skin. Getting dead named and misgendered doesn't normally bug me too much. There were a few examples where certain meetings I got misgendered, so using she pronouns, just a ton. Like, if it's one off here and there, people slip a tongue, like everyone does it. I misgendered myself so many times when I first came out because I lived 20 some years identifying as female publicly, so I called myself she a lot because that's what I grew up doing. So I had to relearn that for myself. But there's one instance in particular that it was a lot in one meeting, and then I don't normally say anything, but it was a lot. So I sent an email to my staff being like, okay, none of you have known me using a she pronoun. When I came, I had a different name, but I used they them pronouns, and that's how I was introduced. So I sent them all an email being like, you guys need to do better. Like, it's a lot. And most of them were very good, but my biggest ally was one staff member who emailed me separately after and asked what can they do next time if that happens, what would I like to see them do, which was a great act of allyship. So basically he let me lead, and then he just changed the words of my email and sent it to the staff being like, we need to hold each other way more accountable. Like, this is hard for Ryan to do all the time. It's exhausting. And it's never been a problem since, which has been fine. The athletes, to be honest, have never messed up my name a single time or my pronouns a single time. Like, it's super, super, super easy. And most people from the coaching staff, the same, super simple. So that's the piece for me, is that it can be harmful. And there's times where it's exhausting to be misgendered constantly or get the dead name. But for the most part, if that happens and someone says something to you, or the person's like, hey, please don't dead name me, or, these are my pronouns, these are the only ones I use, say thank you for telling them, or that you're getting told. You can say sorry, but don't go down a shame spiral, because it's going to make that person have to then console you for making them feel bad, and then move on and do better next time. Like, it doesn't have to always be a big thing, but also understand that, like, you're probably going to screw it up at some point, and that's okay, because we all screw it up. I screw it up for myself and my friends that are trans, even though, like, I obviously know better, but it happens.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for such a vulnerable share, and appreciate that it's okay to mess up. It's how you handle it after. And I certainly have been in that same situation where I've misgendered some of my friends and colleagues, and catch myself and apologize and move on, and not dwell on it. Ness, do you want to add to that, or should we move into the next question?
Sure. I'd to add, wow, I want a second and third. And I think, in terms of adding to it, I would say sometimes it's not about, for me, it hasn't been about the error in terms of the number of times a mistake, is made. A mistake's just a mistake. It is about the context and the message that is then sent with that. And I have been in the position where perhaps I haven't called someone out who has misgendered me for perhaps 3 times in a conversation, until it's happened several times over because of the context of that discussion. So when it comes to sport and our organizations, I think this always comes to my mind as it's not fair. First of all, it's not fair. Accountability isn't fair, and equity is not designed as equality. Organizations do need to do better and need to be setting an example, and that is just part of the quote unquote unfairness of being leaders. And that is the showing allyship and solidarity through vulnerability and highlighting mistakes, in that sense of going, I made a mistake and now I'd like to actually officially say, Ness, who is in the men's category, uses pronouns he, him, and it doesn't need to be about a shame spiral, as Rye said, to either party, but it is about showing that these mistakes will happen and showing how to move on from them and make amends with them. And that's really important. To my personal experience, having to fight for why they're important, as in why gendering me correctly is important, why seeing pronouns creates is important, is a lot of emotional labor. It's really hard to do alone. I feel privileged that there is an individual within my organization who I have had the privilege of watching grow, to grow from a position of what they had expressed as zero knowledge to more recently saying, we are in this together. And that to me was, it's everything. Someone who actually takes it on to do the learning and the growing and recognize their errors and their mistakes and want to do better, and to actually say we, because going it alone is really hard. So that's sort of the bit I would add to it.
Okay. Let's stay on sort of that allyship theme a little bit. What does it mean for each of you when someone uses their pronouns and shares those? Ness, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, yeah. That for me, I guess I should start by bringing to the table that it is a personal choice to display pronouns. And there are many reasons for that, why people will and won't. What I want to say is that as a trans individual, when I see someone's pronouns up as safety, now I don't know I'm actually safe, but I read safety into that, and I can breathe a little easier and I can relax a little bit more and show up as myself. And that makes a huge difference to me. And that's where I would question, I'm always about asking better questions and saying, at what cost is it to not put your pronouns up or to put your pronouns up? What is the cost there that is being bought into in the decision-making process?
Lovely. Ryan, what about you?
I absolutely echo what Ness is saying, that it it shows that it may be safe, but it doesn't guarantee safety. When you see a pronoun, at least gives you the opinion that someone's aware that pronouns exist, and there may be some different ones that you might see, which is nice. So in that perspective, I love it and I love sharing it for that reason. It doesn't mean that I always share it. Sometimes I don't want the first thing about me to be my transness displayed. So sometimes I don't use it. It really depends on the group. But that's mostly how I'm feeling that day. Some days I just really want to be Ryan and just live in the existence as being a human being, and that's it. But I think it's a good step. It's a good way to show that you might be an ally, but don't take offense if you say something and it's not completely correct, and someone calls you out for it just because you have pronouns in your name doesn't mean that it's going to be good, or it's going to be you're going to be the perfect ally, because no one's the perfect ally. Everyone screws up at some point. Just keep in mind that there's lots of things to learn all the time. So I don't have a ton to add there, other than that's pretty much hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, and as we were talking about that, I realized normally when I'm on other mediums, I have my pronouns up, but in this one, I haven't figured out how to do that yet. So my apologies that I didn't do that today, because that's certainly a piece that I think I learned several years ago, is a piece that I can do that is easy and very supportive, and it's also something I'm comfortable doing. So I really appreciated that. I'm going to say disclaimer that you need to be comfortable with sharing that, but also recognize what the value can be. Ness, you came off mute. Did you want to share something else?
Yeah, what I first of all, I'm really touched that you actually highlighted that. So thank you for highlighting that you don't have them up and sharing that. And that idea of humanness. Right to what you said about sometimes you just want to be Ryan. And that's something that I'd like to also say about pronouns. Really, we need to do away with the idea that pronouns equal trans, because there is a privilege in being potentially, a cis het passing individual. That, again, that cost aspect of, right, I recognize that it really, you're putting yourself out there because you identify as non-binary and your pronouns are they, them. Now that I'm on HRT, my pronouns he, him. I potentially am perceived as a cis male. And so recognizing that this privilege, pronouns are not a trans thing. And so the more we can normalize it, as we can normalize introducing our names, it makes it a better world for everyone.
Yeah, not a trans thing, an identity and how you want to be recognized thing. Beautiful. I'd love to go to policies and talk about some of the policies in sport that have maybe created barriers for you in your participation. So Ryan, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. For my playing participation days, policy wasn't really a barrier, but I was also grossly unaware of any language related to myself being trans, so it wasn't really a factor now that I'm in this space a lot more and I read a lot of policy and a lot of things like that. I think, one policy, it's not effective anymore or enacted anymore, but was the IOC policy, I think from 2015, that has, or policies that have testosterone requirements for female competitors. Everything is very, very complicated if we're going to get down to this level of putting testosterone levels in for different events, for different distances and things like that. I think some of those policies can be extraordinarily restrictive and create a lot of barriers for athletes that affect not only trans women in sport, but also some biological women. Some people just have higher testosterone levels biologically than other people. And it's the same in the men's category. Some guys are just better athletes because they have more testosterone than other people potentially. You don't have that restriction as you see in more male focused sports. So I think some of those policies are really, really big barriers and can be very harmful. And then I think at a different level, some policies that could be restrictive I used to play in the summer times, once I came back from university, I played co-ed slow pitch with my dad's team, but slow pitch always had how many women you had to have on the field to make it, and how many where they could bat in the batting order. You couldn't have 4 guys bat in a row and things like that. There always had to be someone in. So even some of those things, even at the true a really recreational level, can be restrictive. And those types of things. Co-ed slow pitch for literally fun. It was beer league slow pitch in my hometown, and we all have these very strict how many girls have to play, and if you didn't have enough that day, you had to forfeit, and all these types of things. Where it was really just a time to go have a couple of beers at the baseball fields, and it was still gender restrictive. So I think some of those policies are barriers to overcome, and it's some creative thinking on the grassroots level and a lot of hard work on the more international level when we're getting down to endocrinology.
Wow, that just harkened me back to intramural ice hockey, where I was the token one of two females on the team and just got annihilated with all of these large humans that I was, and I was not a skilled hockey player to begin with. So thanks for that re-traumatization there. Ness, over to you.
I like that, one of the first things you brought up is testosterone. And I've done a little bit of looking into that. I can definitely say that. And something that amazed me was discovering that a lot of cis male athletes in heavy lifting sports have low testosterone. And I love that we also label it as low, like suddenly it's an inadequacy. But I did find that interesting of that governing a lot of women's sport. And let's talk about it. It's an uncomfortable situation, trans women in women's sport, and when you recognize that women, as in cis females, are also carrying testosterone, when we start to minimize things, we're actually excluding people from the category that we're quote unquote trying to protect. And I always get really intrigued in the conversation and the debate around this, because it makes people uncomfortable. I'm like, so then we need to realize that this is a good conversation. If you're uncomfortable about talking about testosterone being in the room, then it's clearly a policy that needs to be unpacked. And as myself, transitioning on HRT, oh yeah, I turn to my wife and I'm like, hun, wow, I have so much respect. Because, I get on an elliptical now and I'm like, that was a lot easier than it used to be. Recovery's a lot faster. And so I recognize that there are things at play that make a difference that we need to actually start talking about in policy, so it's not just clear cut. So anyway, that's a much bigger topic that we could certainly unpack, and you can tell I get excited because it's one of the great uncomfortable narratives of the moment, especially, unfortunately, and most harmfully, with a lot of the media and rhetoric that's going around in the US at the moment. And let's not pretend that that's an over there conversation, because it's a conversation that's also happening in Canada, and the exclusion is happening here. So policy around that. I think also the policies around how we have organizations showing up about age groups and that, so it comes into a similar thing, the segregation, who's showing up in the room. I had a note about one recently, which was oh yes, the policies, athletes who may or may not be medically transitioning or changing in terms of how they're referred to and the identity. So we need to have more conversation around that, because right now I'm navigating that alone. There is no policy. So I am a top-level international Paralympian, and there is no policy in place for how we navigate my transition going forward. And whilst there is, I want to say the sentence of, we really support you as a person. There are let's go with dichotomies. There are two sides to that. One, great, I'm really accepted. Two, there's another meaning to that. We don't support you as an athlete. So it's really important that we work out how we're supporting our athletes, because timing is timing, and recognizing that potentially coming out was a big move, and that there needs to be policies that account for how athletes will shift, rather than just saying, thanks, it was really nice having you on the team, we support you, good luck in being you. And that's not exactly what I'm going through, but I'm suggesting that that goes around a lot, and I do hear of that a lot. And so we need to actually have things in place.
Wow, lots of pieces for this audience to navigate through and think about. I'm going to go to the other side a bit of around what policies have supported your participation, and what was included in those, and how or why did it help? So Ness, maybe can we stay with you?
Certainly. Yeah, so there's silence because there are no explicit policies. at the moment. That being said, I have been doing a fair bit of work over the last year working on creating some policies with, for example, the CCS, which is the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, around anti-doping, and how trans inclusion comes about with that. I have a very strong ally who said we are in this together. And so putting a case forward for me to remain a national Canadian athlete was something that was supported. There is no policy and there's still not been any policy. So it was very much a one person, lots of supporting documentation. So in that sense, I'm going to say at the moment, I have not experienced there being policy. What there are people. And from people, we need to turn that into policy.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. Ryan, how about you?
I would say the same as Ness. I haven't seen a lot of policy that truly supports inclusion. I think there's pieces here and there, and there's guidance here and there on how to create some better policy on being more inclusive, but a standalone perfect example or great example, I don't think I have one. To be honest, I think it's like, I'm not really sure it exists right now within any part of the sports system.
Okay, so some work to do, and for our audience to think about what are some of those places where athletes, coaches, whoever's part of your sport ecosystem may encounter barriers around gender identity, and start to unpack those and seek out some resources. But Ness, you did reference Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. They do have some template pieces that might be a place to start to understand. We listed some resources at the end of the workbook as well, which we'd shared out and Kevin reposted in the chat today. So there are several other places to look for resources, things like Egal Canada, You Can Play. So there has been some great work done, but it is, I'm going to say, really early days in navigating this. And so there aren't a lot of great examples yet. So we have more work to do. And so part of our call to action for each of you in the audience today is to think about what are some of those pieces that you could take on around gender identities to create more supportive environments. So I actually want to go there with our panelists and ask, what is the first step that you want the leaders in the audience to take today? And so Ryan, maybe kicking off with you.
I think the first step would be for leaders that are here and whoever in your organizations that you represent to reflect on your own personal biases regarding gender and gender identity within sport, and see if it raises any questions for you or any areas where you're like, not really sure about this, and then do some self-education and go out and find the resources and do some research yourself on some of those things. And then I think there's some I don't like to use the phrase low-hanging fruit that can make things a little bit better or show it, but there's some easier, smaller pieces to start with. I think if you look at your policies and you have gendered language just within any of your policies that you have that it's really not necessary, then like make it simple. Try to neutralize the gender instead of he, she, his, her, whatever version of that. Maybe it's, if you're talking about athletes, it's just the athletes, it's the coaches, it's the whatever, or it's just they. That would be like a small thing. I know some other things would be looking at your rule book. If you have different rules about uniforms and costuming based on different gender categories, like maybe there's some language there. I know my partner works in very much a very big kind of corporate job and things like that. And their dress code is 100% like, you need to be business casual. Men will wear this and gives examples, and women will wear this and gives examples. You could just say business casuals dress code and give examples of things that may be business casual, skirts, suits, whatever. So I think some of those places are the first places to start being very, very baseline, and starting small. And then as you get more comfortable in this space and you ask more questions and you do more research and you find different avenues that you want to investigate, then go from there. But you don't have to tackle it all at once. I would say this journey to gender identity inclusion within sport is long, and you're gonna have to ask a lot of questions, and you're gonna get it wrong sometimes, and you're gonna have to try things and then retry things and rewrite things, and it's all just part of the process here.
Thank you. And I think that, it gives people space to recognize that some steps, little steps, building blocks would be really helpful. Ness, I'm going to go to you with the same question. I just want to remind people as we go there that they can pop questions in the chat. We have one that we'll come back to in just a moment.
I love that uniforms is brought up. That was always a nice clench for me, especially as I moved up into national teams, that systems that were set to automatically select what uniform you had access to based upon how you were logged into the registration system. So for competed in a female class, I was only offered female uniform options and had to make a special request. And the anxiety over making a special request before I was out was really hard. So that's something to just keep in mind. Things that, alleviate the need to advocate, especially, when the space isn't necessarily safe and you don't know who's at the other end. I think as a general nod is the first thing to do, and I love this, it came up as Safe Sport, which, implemented right before Tokyo, a Safe Sport online training course. And I can say definitely was traumatizing for me. Really important to now understand navigating safety and harms within sports. So the quote that they used is, "To protect the organization, you need to protect the members of the organization." And at the end of the day, that's where all your policy needs to stem from. So be asking yourself, how does this protect our members? How are we protecting our athletes? No matter what the policy. And so when you then define what athletes are human. We're not looking at, whether you're in the gender binary, also the age group. We need to look at individuals as humans. So that's sort of where I'd be saying to go to. And a resource, I always love this one, which is please go and look at the A's of allyship. Andrea, I'm totally plugging that over and saying, please type that in the chat for us. But the A's of allyship is to start, because it talks about how the work is arduous. Because allyship isn't putting a sticker up, it's not a platitude, it's actually moving to be active and intentional and not transactional. So that's what I have to say in terms of, it's not just policy, it's about a culture. So think of this as organizational culture.
Awesome. And what Ness is referencing, we have a blog on our website at Inclusion Incorporated. There's a section for blogs, and there's a whole blog around the A's of allyship. So I would look up the link, but I'm a little worried I'll derail finishing up this conversation. So if anyone has capacity to pop the actual link in the chat, feel free. But thanks for that, Ness. So I want to go to Karina's question, which is around, sort of a traditional sporting community of equestrian, and that the categories themselves aren't gendered, but they haven't necessarily dug into thinking about gender identities per se and how to surface this. So Karina, I really want to answer that question, but I'm going to give Ness and Ryan the first opportunity to do that. Oh, look, 2 people posted the link in the chat. That's brilliant. Thank you, Kelly and Jamie, for throwing that up there. So yeah, where should people start to bring this conversation forward in their sport, or in a more traditional sporting community where folks might not have been thinking about this? Ryan, do you want to go first?
Link in the chat as well.
Yeah.
So questions about the sport's not gendered, but kind of gendered at the same time. I think that's an interesting question. How to bring it to a high traditional sporting community. I think I work in a sport that has a traditional sporting community for itself. And the way that I propose making any changes towards any type of inclusion or any type of diversity within the sport that's non-traditional is talking about innovation and the way sports need to change to keep going. Like if we're talking about Olympic equestrian, then like, you know, the Olympics are at its core a spectator event. Like people want to watch because it's cool. So if there's other things that can change, that'll make the sport more entertaining to watch. Like that's a selling point that I use in the sport of artistic swimming when we talk about bringing in more males or more male identified people into the sport, is that if we can get our throws higher and the highlights and the cool things that people do above the water can look better because they're higher and there's more time to do backflips and all those kinds of things, it'll be a much more innovative sport and it'll go that way. And it'll encourage people to go, okay, maybe we do need to change things and maybe we can bring in some more different people and different types of things. It's not, you know, it's not a hard, direct conversation of like why we need to include different gender identities in it, but it's a palatable way to get people thinking about the good that people from outside the traditional community can do within the sports, within that particular sport. It's not the perfect answer to have to go that way. I also think that, like, depending on the community that you're in, if you have an in with someone or a good relationship with someone who is connected within the community and can help champion causes and like take the message with you and help push it along in different communities, whether it's within the athletes or the coaches or the NSOs and the PTSOs and the local sport clubs or the officials and things like that. Like there's all groups of people that have to come together to create these changes in sport. So having some champions in each type of group that's invested in sport, in a particular sport, I think is really helpful as a strategy to try to push some change.
Yeah, great example, Ryan. And I think so powerful to sort of tie it back to like, you know, what are the benefits? How can people kind of reframe this from like, oh, what do we have to do to, hey, this could be a huge opportunity for your sport. And ultimately, when we look at sport, thinking about sort of sport should be about bringing people in and supporting them to be successful and ultimately creating cultures where they can feel like they belong. And we're not there right now in many of our sporting cultures across the country. Ness, do you want to answer that same question?
I think the only thing I would add is a question, which is why about it. And I think, you know, that's a way to get people actually talking about it, which is, you know, so why don't you talk about gender? Why aren't you talking about different identities? And, you know, often the response is, well, it's not really relevant here. And my answer to that is always, that's privilege. And that's, you know, it starts the conversation. Again, another uncomfortable, potentially pushback conversation. But the great thing that comes of this is recognizing any conversation that a person is not having about anything is usually because it's not on their radar. Not on their radar, that doesn't mean it's not on a lot of other people's. And so that's about expanding how we different perspectives and not just seeing through our own lens. And I think that's a great way to get conversations started so we don't talk about it, why don't we talk about it? And let's talk about it. And that creates sort of an openness.
Yeah, I love the tie back to privilege. And for those that privilege is maybe not something you've explored, privilege really, a kind of a simple way to think about it is learning about something rather than living it. And so that's kind of a bit of a frame around that space of privilege. So I'll give my answer as well, which is that, you know, this conversation is an opportunity to surface the topic and it will be recorded and shared. And so would encourage you, maybe you take that and share that out to leaders in your organization and invite a conversation post them watching it to think about like, what does gender mean in our sport? How do we have these conversations? What do we need to be paying attention to? So I think education and awareness is a really powerful starting place because to Ness's point, many folks haven't thought about it. And our opportunity is definitely now because I can't think of a space in our society that's changing quicker than gender identities right now. It is definitely evolved and will continue to evolve. And, you know, to the point that we see when our new census data comes out, that we will have not just binary gender categories anymore, that it's evolving. We're counting who's in our world in a very different way. Okay, well, on that note, I think maybe I'll move us to wrap up. We don't have any other questions in the chat. What's going to happen next is an opportunity for some table conversations for you to dig into a couple of the topics we've talked about today. So I'm going to share up those table topics and do one wrap-up slide, and then invite Ness and Ryan to just share sort of any last thoughts they have as we send you off. So we have labeled the tables, not that we're trying to label things today, but to give you some spaces to go and explore a couple of these topics we've surfaced today. The Gender Unicorn is a tool that we shared with you in the workbook that looks at how some of the terminology is attached to sort of who we are. Then there's the terminology table. We also shared lots of terms in the workbook with you that you can dig into and have a conversation about. We talked about registration forms earlier in the conversation today, so an opportunity to have a conversation about what that maybe looks like in your sport and what other sports might be doing or thinking about doing. We talked about policy today, so an opportunity to chat about that. We didn't talk too much about event hosting considerations, but we've put a couple of ideas here for you to think about in terms of gender neutral change rooms, announcers, how we're using pronouns and descriptors around folks within competitions, competition categories, lots to dig into there. So our kind of wrap-up slide is a bit of a nudge and reminder that our next session is on May 18th. We'd originally scheduled it a week earlier, but the incredible folks at Spark Alberta are doing their Spark Summit the week prior, and we didn't want to conflict with that. So would encourage you to join us for that next one. We're going to be talking about supporting low-income families in sport and have some incredible speakers lined up. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to invite Ryan and Ness for sort of a last word before we send you out to the tables. Ryan, do you want to go?
Sure. I think my last word for this space, and I think we've all said it in different ways, is that sport is about people. And I think sometimes in the sports system, we forget about the people that are there. We think of people pretty much as their role in the sport. They're either an administrator, or they're an athlete, or they're a coach, or they're a ref, right? That's how we view them. That's how we see them in the field of play, or whatever variation of things. And in most sport, we're here to win in a lot of sports. So I think my take home message for sport, and it all goes to gender identity and how you interact with different genders within your sporting system, is people over performance. Is highlight your people, work with your people, treat them as individuals, and treat them as human beings first. Performance will come. There's lots of studies about how people who feel like they belong perform better, and all those types of things. And if mental health improves, all their performances go better as well. But within this space, I would say people over performance. And if you're not sure about something, ask questions. I mean, I see a question in here from Stephanie Davidson about neo-pronouns and different pronouns that exist. It's a great question, Stephanie. And I think there's a link within your workbook. There's a pronoun exercise, I think on page 2, potentially, that has a link that says neo-pronouns embedded within it, and it'll take you to a resource on neo-pronouns for those people who don't know what I'm talking about. It's just pronouns that are not he, him, she, her, they, them. And neo basically means new. So new pronouns that exist, and lots of people use them, and it'll give you how to say them and different types of things. But ask questions when you're not sure, and just lead with people first, and the rest will come.
Amazing. Thanks, Ryan. Ness.
I'm going to start by saying I really appreciate that all of you showed up today, because that is doing something active. And right now, to my mind, sport is both the great divide and the great unifier. And it's a microcosm of society and all that's happening in society and the rhetoric around, I guess, the harm that's going. But we all have a responsibility to do the work and to show up. And in making these steps, you will change. Something I believe in is that there is enough space for all of us. And I want to leave you with my invitation to help us create that space. So thank you all.
Over the articulate ending. Thank you, Ness. That was beautiful. So yeah, thanks so much, folks. Thank you, Ryan and Ness, for being here with me, for being vulnerable, for sharing your stories. I learn from you each and every time I get the opportunity to work with each of you. And I'm just so grateful about how open you are and how brave you are to step into spaces that weren't necessarily built in the way that you need them to be, and to have the power and ownership to help us make this world better and more trans inclusive. So thank you both for that. And to our audience, I want to echo Ness's thanks for being here. And as we step out of the stage space and go back to the room, there will be the opportunity. You'll see there's labels on the different couches, tables, and you can click to whichever one interests you. There's a couple of each. So find one where there's some other folks there and have a great conversation. And we'll look forward to seeing you in a month.